Hey, Crawlspacers, welcome to the Wizard St. Louis Comic-Con. We're here with Danny Fingeroth, the former editor of Amazing Spider-Man.
Amazing Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, Web of Spider-Man, Marvel Team-Up starring Spider-Man, Spider-Man Unlimited, Spider-Man buys lunch, Spider-Man picks his nose, anything and everything with Spider-Man, I was the editor of.
I love it. Talk about when you started with Marvel.
I started with Marvel in the bygone era, in the year 1977, which is not what it says in Wikipedia. Wikipedia makes me even older than I am. I started in 1977 as the assistant in the British department to Larry Lieber, who of course is Stan's brother and is famous in his own right as he's still the artist of the Spider-Man newspaper strip. And Larry was the man who wrote the script of the first Iron Man story, the first Thor story. He's the guy who invented the term Uru, and many other things. So that was my first job as the assistant.
Now, was that based in New York, or where was that based?
It was based in New York. We had a New York office in the Marvel office, and there also was a British office. And my counterpart in England was a guy named Neil Tennant, who turned out to be one of the Pet Shop Boys. But we didn't know that then. He was just this guy in the British office in London.
And Spider-Man had different original stories in Britain, didn't it?
Spider-Man did not, but there was an original. There was an original series called Captain Britain.
Okay, right.
There were some original Hulk stories at one point. I can't, maybe either before or after I was doing it, there might have been original Spider-Man. Yeah. We did a lot of original covers and new splash pages because they used to take the stories and break them down, or we used to take them and break them down into shorter, like you take a 17 or a 20 or a 22-page story and break it into 6 or 7-page chapters and then do a new splash page, which would usually, that was a good training ground for new writers and new artists. And because the British had a tradition, maybe they still do, of their comics coming out weekly with a lot of short features in each comic.
Kind of like we do now with weekly comics.
I guess so. And then there was also, at one point, I was the assistant on the Star Wars comic, which they were using in a comic called Star Wars Weekly that lasted, that came out. We gave like 11 pages every 2 weeks. No, every week. So that means we were using comics, the Star Wars comics, double the rate in America. So we were way ahead. That was the only one of the few comics that was way ahead of schedule. Right. And I ended up becoming the assistant editor to Archie Goodwin because I was so involved with that.
Talk about your love of Spider-Man when you first discovered the character. I'm assuming you love Spider-Man.
I do. I love Spider-Man. I don't think I owned Amazing Fantasy 15, but I definitely bought Amazing Spider-Man #1 off the newsstand.
Wow. What happened to it?
I at various points in my life, I made misguided efforts at maturity, and so I think I either gave them away. I think there was a woman who lived in my building who used to work at a hospital, and so I would give her comics to give to the kids. So yeah, no, I'm not. I have never been one of those people who puts things in plastic bags, and I probably should have been, but my collection is well thumbed and well worn.
I like the story went to a sick kid as opposed to the trash can.
There you go. Well, that's true. That is a good story. Spider-Man, I liked Spider-Man well enough. As a kid, my favorites was definitely, far and away the Fantastic Four and Steranko's Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and I loved Iron Man. I said I liked Spider-Man well enough, but I don't think I really appreciated Spider-Man till I was involved with the character professionally.
Talk about how you became. Did you start as the editor of Amazing Spider-Man, all the titles?
Well, I worked. I started, as I said, I worked for Larry in the British department. Then a guy named Des Skin came over. He was a British publisher, and you might know him as the editor and publisher of Warrior magazine in the 80s. Des, was convinced Marvel that maybe these British comics should be put out by actual British people. What a concept. And so at that point, I went into the mainstream. Larry went over to the Hulk strip and the Spider-Man strip, and I went into the mainstream editorial. I did a line of reprint books for Jim Shooter, and then I became Louise Simonson's assistant on the X-Men books and Star Wars and Star Trek and Conan, and we had a lot of books. And then a couple of years later, I became promoted to be the editor of all the Spider-Man titles.
And now, I got this off of Comic Vine for the issues that you did. This could be incorrect, but correct me if I'm wrong. You started with 246 and went till 263 of Amazing, you think?
That's more or less. There were some issues where I edited them but didn't get credit. Others I did get credit but didn't. But basically, it sounds more or less right. That was my first phase in the 80s. Then later on, I was the editor of the books again in the 90s. So, but this in that first phase.
So, by rough estimates, Amazing 246 you started until 263, and then you came back in the 90s from 346 up to 400.
I'll take your word for it.
Okay. One of the milestones during your first run was 252. What was it like to release that issue? It was sold out. I couldn't find a copy of it. With the black suit.
Yeah, that was the first appearance of the black suit. Well, we knew it would be big, but I don't think anybody knew how big. And there was a certain amount of trepidation because we were messing with the suit of this iconic character. And so people could just as easily have hated it, or, they could, I guess it's always possible if someone is scanning the racks and looking for Spider-Man and they see this guy in the black suit, maybe they would, but they wouldn't think it was Spidey. But obviously it worked out very well. It was a great cover that Ron Frenz and Klaus Janson did. It was a transition period between between Stern and DeFalco as well. So there was a lot going on. And it was also part of the Secret War, it was the beginning of the Secret War. So there was all this stuff going on. Nobody had ever really done a crossover of that scale before. So if I had to try to remember, I have a feeling I was probably as much or more concerned with making the entry, all the comics ended one month with the characters disappearing into this big construct in Central Park. And then they emerge. So I think the next month, I was probably as much or more concerned with making that work. And the suit was just, that's a gimmick that we'll have for a couple of months. But of course, it turned out to be so popular that we ended up doing riffs on it to this day. Venom is the ultimate riff on the suit.
Now the rumor, you can put this to rest. Jim Shooter bought the black costume idea for, I guess, $100 from a kid or something. Is that true?
Well, I don't know if it was a kid. I think it was a aspiring writer who sent in the idea for the black suit, and then I guess Jim. I never saw it. I don't remember seeing it, but I think Jim didn't like the guy's writing, or didn't think he was ready. But he did like the idea of the black Spider-Man suit, so they paid him. In my mind is either 500 or 1,000. I think it was more than $100. And don't forget, it was 30 years ago when that was
equal to 2,000 now,
or 3. It was certainly
If you look at some Marvel Age images, the white on the black suit was also red. They colored it a little bit differently, and then they decided to go with the white. Any thoughts on that? Or?
Well, I was involved with.
Okay. The red looks pretty good.
Look, when you, as part of the process of designing a character in a costume, as you go through different color schemes. So, again, I'll take your word for it. If you say we did red, I guess we did red. But, I don't remember there being much debate. The white seemed the most striking against the black costume.
Now, talk about when you left around 263 and you came back, what was it, 5 years later, I guess, when you came?
5 years later.
What brought you back?
I went freelance in 1984. Jeez. I decided I wanted to try my hand at going freelance, and I became the writer of Web of Spider-Man for a time, and there was all sorts of interesting stuff going on in the office, but I ended up as the editor of the Marvel Saga, which I worked on with the great Peter Sanderson, and I did that as a freelance editor. I also wrote Sci-Force, and I wrote a lot of Iron Man, and just a whole bunch of different assorted stuff. And then I just, at a certain point, there were things going on, both professionally and personally, that made me feel like I wanted to come back on staff. And I had a standing offer from Jim Shooter and from Tom DeFalco that anytime I wanted to come back, the next opening would be mine. So that's what happened. And but I didn't get the Spider-Man books right away. I got a lot of Epic comics. I worked with on Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. I worked with Dennis Kitchen on that project, as well as with Mark Schultz.